How many people in the audience believe in equity and justice? How many people believe that education is one of the most powerful tools in building a future society? Now, how many people here identify as a white supremacist? So we can pretty much agree that we want a more equitable and just society, and that education is an important part of building that, and that no one here is consciously advancing white supremacy. But is it possible that we might be passing along white supremacist culture to our students through our educational system without even realizing it? I became very aware of white supremacy in 3rd grade because I had a teacher who was actively advancing white supremacy. This teacher chased around an African American boy in the classroom, shoved him against a wall, held him down, and forced him to eat soap. And the reason she did that is because that student spoke up against her. And the reason that he spoke up against her was because throughout the year, one by one, she was moving the African American students to one side of the classroom until the classroom was segregated into white students and black students. And one day she looked at the white students in the classroom and she said, "Don't you wish we could put a curtain there so we didn't have to look at them?" Now we could dismiss this whole story as an anomaly, as an instance of something horrible and shocking that happened in education. And we could say that that teacher was racist and what she did was wrong. And we could really just dismiss the whole thing and that would be the end of my talk. However, I would like to suggest that we stay here for a minute. And I want to ask you if we can take this kind of as a frozen picture of this moment in this classroom. And instead, look at it as a metaphor for the entire educational system in the US. Because actually what that teacher taught me in that moment was more valuable than what the other teachers were teaching me in the 1980s in Delaware, where a lot of the other teachers were teaching me that it was right to be colorblind and not to see race, and that race didn't matter. I knew from that moment on that race did matter and that I was being treated differently because of my race. And in that moment, that teacher was trying to tell me that I was on the same side as her by default because I looked like her. And I didn't want to be on her side. Now, if I just automatically say I'm not on her side, I would never do any of those things, and I push her away from me, and I draw a line between her and me, I'm not really looking at the whole picture. So instead, I want to just stay here for a minute and unpack this. And I want to start by looking at myself. So Dr. Chris Emdin, who's a teacher for teachers at Columbia College, says that education is the civil rights issue of our time. So if I look at myself, is it possible that being taught in this way, that I might be passing on some of these same facets of white supremacy culture? And if so, don't we need to talk about that? So I would like to propose 4 different ways that we can look at this situation if we stay here with it, and kind of unpack each one. What was happening in that moment and how could we rewrite it? In Audre Lorde's essay, "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House," she's arguing that we can't actually undo a system with the same tools that created it, right? So we can't really address white supremacy if we're unknowingly just passing on white supremacist values. And what I'm talking about here is not a person who is a supremacist, I'm talking about the culture. In Dismantling Racism, a workbook for social change, they talk about the facets of white supremacy culture. So here's one of them. One of them is this silence, where I didn't tell anybody about what was happening in that classroom. My own family didn't know about this until very recently. So why aren't we talking about white supremacy, and how does silence keep it there? And we think about that teacher and how she said, let's put a curtain up. Well, what actually is that curtain? For a long time, that curtain was actually segregation, until in 1974 in Delaware, the state was forced by the Superior Court to desegregate the schools. But still, if we're not talking about how white supremacy is playing out, we're not actively trying to undo that, we're putting a curtain up, we're silencing. So the first thing we really need to do is talk about it and acknowledge it. And for me, it was really helpful to learn about the facets of white supremacy culture, that it's not me. None of us invented it, right? None of us here invented racism. And it's not attached to the skin that I was born in and me being white, that I'm not inherently a bad racist person, but that we're all schooled in white supremacy culture growing up in the US. And we have to really look at that piece by piece and think about how we might be carrying on values that we don't even believe in. Another part of white culture that we often don't look at is that it's an individualist culture. And this is something that Debbie Irving talks about in Waking Up White, and also that Zaretta Howard talks about in Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. As we're working through an individualist culture, in that situation in the classroom, my response was to say nothing because I wanted to protect myself. The only student who actually said something to that teacher was the African American boy who was then chased around the room and physically assaulted as an 8-year-old. So we have to think about where we are in that room. And I want to ask everybody just to imagine right now, we're not in a classroom, but that we're playing out that scenario every day in our society. And think about where you're positioned. Now, people of color have less options in that system as far as how to act. Because as Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about in Between the World and Me, African American people, after years and years of being dehumanized by the ideology of slavery, African American students' bodies are actually physically at risk, just the way that student in the classroom was physically at risk from that teacher. I was not physically at risk, so I actually had more options in that scenario. I could have gotten up and I could have walked to the other side of the room. I could have said something, this is wrong. I could have told the principal. I could have gotten everybody up together. And I probably wouldn't have been in so much risk. So really, I just had to make myself uncomfortable. And really, I had to kind of cross an unspoken line there. And the reason I think about this all the time is not because I was so traumatized by this, because really, I wasn't the one who was traumatized in this situation. I think about it every day because I see it playing out over and over again. I see myself in situations where we are put on sides according to race. And if we think of this teacher not as a person, but as an arm of a system, and the way that we are separated, we can see that a lot of our schools are still segregated today. And that brings me to my third point, which is really that we have to look at the simple fact. Recently, there was a report published by EdBuild showing that predominantly white school districts receive $2,000 more per child than predominantly school districts with students of color. And that translates to about $23 billion in resources. We have to look at that as a fact, right? And see how actually our schools are still segregated. And if we believe in equity and justice, that we want to do something about that. Because me feeling guilty about that doesn't do anything. And me putting the curtain up doesn't do anything to help anybody. And me feeling like because I'm white, I shouldn't be part of this conversation, or because I'm not an expert and I don't have a degree in sociology, that I shouldn't be part of the conversation, that doesn't help anybody. I have to stand up and talk here. I have to do something. And I have to say, yes, I actually am an expert in white supremacy because I was raised in this culture. And I was raised in a system that supports that. And yes, I actually have power here. I have privilege here. I'm in the master's house. I can walk through the front door of the master's house. But if I'm trying to use the tools of the master to undo that, it's not going to be effective. White folks can only do so much. But I have to be aware of my own power so that I can give that as a support, so that I can elevate people of color to positions of power through education. And we want to see those students succeed. Which brings me to my fourth point, which is, what do I have control over right now? And one thing that I have control over in my own classroom is what curriculum I teach and how I teach it. So it's not enough really to just teach diverse voices. I might feel like I'm not that important. Like, I'm a teacher of singing, vocal music, and I teach some creative writing and language arts too. But these are both subject matters that have to do with voice. And the way that I teach can either silence students of color or it can empower them to speak up. I can pass the mic and pass that power that I have and give that to them. But it's not going to work if I only feature voices of color as people who are marginalized. If I only feature voices of people of color as being discriminated against and struggling and being oppressed, because that's passing on that narrative. So instead, I can look at things like Afrofuturism. I can look at things like Hamilton that are reimagining the places of people of color in society. I can pass the mic to the students and help them to be able to share what's culturally relevant right now for them. And just give them the tools that I've been given in education to articulate that. Give them my platform. Give them the ability to make their own tools. And then they can help to dismantle that house. Because really, we need to all work together. What that teacher was trying to teach me was that there are two sides, and that I was on her side. Now, she was correct that I was put on her side by society because of the skin color I was born into. But she was not correct that I have to stay there. I only stay there if I'm silent and I do nothing. And I just play it safe and don't want to become uncomfortable. I don't actually have to stay there on that side, because really the sides that we're on is, are you actively working to dismantle white supremacy and starting with yourself and looking inside yourself? So Audre Lorde says in that same essay, we have to look inside of ourselves and see that fear and loathing and terror that we have of other people who are different. Because if we're able to embrace our differences, that's actually where all of the power that we have, all of the knowledge that we have, and our future society will come from, in holding that difference, bringing it out into light, talking to each other about it. So I'm going to give you a charge today. I'm going to ask you to go out and keep talking about white supremacy. Keep talking about it until, as Ta-Nehisi Coates says, we can imagine a future where no one is white. Thank you very much.